Okay, so welcome everyone. My name's Lisa Cliff. I'm the Program Director for Better Futures Australia, and I'd like to begin today's webinar by acknowledging we're all joining this call from First Nations land. For me, that's Yagara and Turrbal country here in Meanjin, Brisbane, that I now have the privilege to call my home. I pay my deep respects to elders past and present, and am thankful for their wisdom in looking after country so that we may continue to enjoy the benefits of their labour today. May we live up to the example they have set in continuing to care for and enjoy the benefits of the country that we now call home. I invite each of you to acknowledge the various countries you're calling in from in the chat, and also your workplace and interest in the call today. Before introducing our excellent panelists to get the conversation started, I'd like to share a quick introduction to those of you new to Better Futures Australia. We are a 2-year-old non-partisan alliance involving climate champions from every sector of society and the economy: finance, business, agriculture, health, social service, faith, researchers, think tanks, local governments, First Nations, unions, and more, who are calling for ambitious national targets and action and reimagining our future by demonstrating scalable climate solutions and success stories already underway. There is excellent work underway across Better Futures Australia's several active sector working groups to use the first 100 days of the new Albanese government at the Better Futures Forum on the 15th and 16th of August in Canberra or online to set an ambitious national climate agenda that puts Australia on track for a climate resilient zero emissions future. This policy dialogue is one of a series to start building on the critical conversations needed to see commitments for collaborative action plans come out of the forum and see the next term of the Australian government deliver our fair share under the Paris Climate Agreement. Details of the Better Futures Forum are taking shape now, so please do submit an expression of interest if you have ideas for how we can make that impactful and bring it to life. Our excellent intern, Annalise from the University of Melbourne, is sharing that link in the chat for you now. So today we have 4 inspiring individuals joining us. A huge thank you to each of them for taking the time out to be here. They've each been invited to share brief introductions to be followed by a discussion in response to any questions you may have. So please do post your questions in the chat as we go. We'll aim to wrap today's webinar at 1 p.m. Sydney time. And I'd like to do a shout out to Annalise Adam, the excellent intern. She's also working on a research report exploring how non-state actors, so businesses and subnational governments and non-government organisations, can play a role in influencing equitable climate policy in Victoria as a case study, so to decarbonise the built environment sector, working with different levels of government there. So we will be publishing a summary of Annalise's report on the BFA website, so do keep an eye out for that. The recent Ipcc climate change mitigation report highlighted the inertia that's holding back decarbonisation of Australia and the world's built environment sector. And they recommended the sector must undergo a 73% decrease in emissions by 2030 if the world is to keep warming to 1.5 degrees. And they called on architects and urban planners to rethink the way that they work. The good news is that many dedicated experts, like the 4 wonderful people on the call today, have already conceived of and recommended various solutions, with numerous case studies highlighting the possibilities of a better climate resilient future if we're successful in engaging the decision makers to apply those solutions. Our panelists today will share what they see as the current and future challenges and opportunities for creating a better zero emissions built environment sector, and how businesses, communities, and others might work together with the Albanese government to realise those opportunities. So to kick off today's discussion, I would like to introduce Hudson Wesley, who is also a worm farmer and the neighbourhood worm juice provider, and is the chair of MECLA, the Materials and Embodied Carbon Leaders Alliance. So Hudson has extensive experience collaborating with various stakeholders within the construction industry, with an aim to uphold the water and energy efficiency of buildings. Hudson is also the co-founder and director of a local infrastructure design firm, Presync. This work is crucial to decrease carbon emissions and integrate principles of a circular economy within the built environment sector. Thanks so much for joining us, Hudson.
Thanks, Lisa. It's very nice to be here. I'm here very much with my MECLA hat on, but thank you for the introduction. I've just put the MECLA website link in the chat for everybody. MECLA stands for Materials and Embodied Carbon Leaders Alliance. It's a network, a collaboration that's grown very rapidly. We set it up with my little business, Presync, and WWF. I happen to sublease a little office inside the Panda headquarters, and around the water cooler, conversations flow. We worked together on establishing the Renewable Energy Buyers Forum some years ago, which has morphed into the Business Renewable Centre Australia. And having seen the success of building a collaboration of willing partners in an immature market to come together to tackle climate problems, we thought, hey, embodied carbon's the next big item. And so we started calling around. We did a foundation piece of research, talking to 30 different stakeholders throughout the supply chain. And I actually I'm a former management consultant, still in rehab, and I drew up the value chain of a project lifecycle up on the whiteboard and started drawing arrows and loops all around. And we realized this is an ecosystem, it's not linear. And so by really starting to apply systems thinking, we looked what's supply side, what's demand side, who are the decision makers in between, and where are the leverage points where embodied carbon can be reduced or whether it's locked in inadvertently. And so based on that, we started to invite participants from the supply side like Boral and BlueScope and InfraBuild and Wholesome, and head contractors like Lend-Lease and Lang O'Rourke, and decision makers like Engineers Australia, at the Institute of Architects, the Green Building Council, Infrastructure Sustainability Council, and so on, to bring together a collaboration of people who on their own can't change the ecosystem, but together can. And so we call it a do tank. No offense to think tanks, but this is about doing. We're not wanting to produce deep research papers and generate PhDs. We want to take that information and say, what does it mean to Lend-Lease? What does it mean to Boral? We heard early on in our research that aluminium providers did market research to say, well, what's the market for green aluminium, for recycled or low emission aluminium? And I don't know what planet their researchers came from, but they came back saying, oh, there's no market. And yet when we spoke to Lend-Lease and Hassel Architects and so on, they're saying, all our facades for commercial buildings these days are aluminium. We're crying out for low emission product, but we can't get it. So there's clearly a disconnect in this emerging market. And MECLA has set about addressing that. We have 120 founding partners with seed funding from New South Wales government, but very much not geographically tied. We set up during COVID, which one of the unforeseen benefits was we were freed of any geography. It was all online. So we brought together 120 members from around the ecosystem, looking at what can be done, what's in the way, what needs to get around it, what can happen now, and what is a bit harder. And by having the engagement, the conversation, our working groups on supply side, on demand side, on decision making, on definitions, preparing a dictionary of carbon, we're hoping that we're seeing the ecosystem come together with goodwill pre-competition to progress the uptake of low emission building materials.
Excellent.
I'll pause there because I could talk all day on this. So I thought that's probably 3 minutes. I'll stop.
That's excellent. Thanks, Hudson. And I do love the do tank idea. That's just such a good reframing and action oriented. So thank you so much for sharing your insights. And next, I have the pleasure to introduce you all to Heidi Lee, who, a fun fact, she volunteered for Beyond Zero Emissions for 10 years before becoming the now CEO and chair of Beyond Zero Emissions. Beyond Zero Emissions is an independent think tank that aims to research and showcase practical solutions to climate change. Heidi has contributed to various infrastructure-related projects, including the Energy Efficient Buildings Plan and Energy Freedom Home Book, providing her with specialised sectoral knowledge, which we look forward to hearing about today. Thanks so much for joining us, Heidi.
Thank you, Lisa and Hudson. Great intro to MECLA. I love MECLA. Small clarification in my intro. I'm not the chair of Beyond Zero Emissions. I chair the board of Common Equity Housing, a social housing provider, one of the largest in Victoria, who support more than 100 co-ops around Victoria to manage their own homes. So some experience in the social housing sector, but the chair of Beyond Zero Emissions is Jeff Summerhays. So our background in research and action comes from the initial work that Beyond Zero Emissions started in 2010 around creating those sector decarbonisation pathways. And while we are a think tank and we publish big books, you can see the glory wall behind me here, the way that we do that is in partnership with volunteers, skilled volunteers from all around Australia and sometimes around the world, to be able to draw on the collective wisdom of the fantastic people, and I'm sure many people on the call today will have at some point, if you're interested in decarbonisation, you've probably contributed to Obesity Project, and for that I thank you. So our work starts with the energy sector. And we say, well, energy is kind of easy technically. All we need to do is to replace, turn off all of our fossil fuels that are fueling our energy sector and replace them with renewable energy. And so Beyond Zero Emissions start with that framing. So what can we do? First of all, we know that that can happen. So let's make sure that that does happen and then focus our research successively in on each of the other sectors of the economy where we find other challenges to decarbonisation. One of the sectors, obviously we went across all of them, but when we started in 2011 working on our plan to decarbonise every building in the country, one of the main challenges you find with the building sector is the number of stakeholders involved in making decisions about which buildings get upgraded. So of course we have all of our homes, our houses, apartments, we have a lot of small businesses, we have such a diversity of ownership that being able to reach all buildings is incredibly hard. So in 2013, we published our plan, which looked at the technical opportunities for being able to do decarbonisation. And you could. If we wanted to, we could rapidly decarbonise every single building in the country and get it to zero emissions and net zero emissions by doing those energy efficiency upgrades that I'm sure we'll hear about from others on the call, and also from deploying solar and batteries onto our homes. Now, we did it pretty crudely like that. The truth, when we actually do decarbonise Australia's building sector, will be more nuanced than that. There's efficiencies of scale that we can get by coordinating on neighbourhood energy solutions, on neighbourhood batteries, and a lot of other things can happen in conjunction with this. So it's not just about the buildings, it's really about cities and urban design that gives us that opportunity to work at scale to decarbonise. And that's a really important component of some of the building efficiency standards that have evolved over the time that I've been involved in the building sector and in decarbonising stuff at Beyond Zero Emissions, is being able to scale up from an individual building, an individual decision maker, and to amalgamate demand for decarbonisation, for energy upgrades, so that you can create solutions at a scale that makes sense. I wanted to leave my intro with one last thought. In 2020, we published a COVID plan or a COVID recovery plan called the Million Jobs Plan, where we looked specifically at the opportunities to build a really strong economy, to create jobs and distributed benefits across all of Australian communities, because we were all feeling it really hard and many people are still finding it very hard. Our COVID recovery is not done yet. That's one of the challenges of this new government. Central to that plan was scaling up a retrofit program. We looked at technical possibilities, and our role as a think tank, our role at Beyond Zero Emissions, is around raising the ambition of what's happening in industry and in government. Our research shows that we could be retrofitting 500,000 homes per year. If we did that, if we invested the equivalent of roughly 25 grand per home, we would basically eliminate heating and cooling bills and create an awful lot of health benefits and comfort across Australian communities. The challenge for us in this space is to come up with those policy solutions that enable us to reach those very tough to decarbonize sectors where there's many, many stakeholders, including our upcoming work, flag for upcoming work, watch this space, around solutions for renters to be able to access these upgrades at scale.
Thanks so much, Heidi. That's really insightful. And I'd now like to introduce you all to Carlos Flores, who is the, who, fun fact, can play the two guitars behind him, but not the yalos. So when asking him to play, just keep that in mind. Carlos is the director of NABERS, the National Australian Built Environment Rating System. NABERS is a highly successful initiative which has gained international recognition that extensively rates, compares and evaluates buildings based on their usage of water, energy, waste and the indoor environment management. Carlos's work is necessary to ensure infrastructure is continually assessed and improved upon to increase sustainability within the sector. Thanks so much for joining us, Carlos.
Thank you, Lisa. It's really great to be here, and also it's really great to be in this industry government events. I'm the representative of government, I guess, in this panel, and I'm going to build a little bit on what Heidi said, because a lot of our work is in the building sector, and I completely agree with everything you said about residential, Heidi. I think it's a space that needs a lot of work. A lot of the work that we do is in non-residential space, so we're thinking about offices, hotels, industrial buildings, data centers, shopping centers. A lot of medium and large buildings is the space that NABERS has historically worked in. And I'm also going to be the first person to show you a graph today, so I'm going to apologize in advance for that. And I just shared my screen. I hope that you can see this. If you cannot, please let me know. But I want to show you what NABERS is very quickly with a graph. NABERS is a star rating with certified buildings, and I'm going to talk a lot about energy, even though we work in other spaces as well, energy and carbon today. And I wanted to show you what this looks like for one building, one of the few thousand buildings that we work with, and then we're going to scale up and see what that means for the whole market. But I want to talk about Australia Square. It's a building in Sydney. We work nationally, but this happens to be in Sydney. You may know that it used to be the largest building in Australia for about, I think, 15 or 20 years. That was before I came to Australia, way before my era, but in the 70s and 80s. And NABERS certifies buildings based on how much energy and carbon emissions you're emitting compared to similar buildings in the same space. And this building was 0 stars in 2015, which means that it was one of the most inefficient buildings in Australia by that point. And that was the beginning of the journey. And that's not that unusual. A lot of buildings use a lot of energy, and they haven't really done a lot of work in energy efficiency before. And they use just a lot more than buildings around them. And actually, most of them, most of managers of hotels, most managers of shopping centers in Australia and around the world, they have no idea whether they're using a lot or not. They just don't. Just like you may not know whether you're using a lot of energy consumption in the building you're in today compared to other buildings. It's actually information that is not that easy to get. So that's what NABERS does. It's about comparing buildings. And NABERS encourages buildings to set targets for next year, reduce your consumption next year, and improve. And what this building is basically been doing is improving year on year, setting targets, looking for opportunities, and going from being one of the most inefficient buildings in the city to being one of the most efficient buildings across Australia. And that actually took a lot of work and a lot of people working on that, but it's like year on year. And that's really what we're trying to encourage. It's not energy efficiency, sustainability. It's not about doing one upgrade and replacing equipment. It's about looking for every opportunity you have to become better. I want to show you quickly what this meant in terms of energy consumption. So this is energy intensity, energy per meter square. And this is a building that reduced about 65% of their energy consumption in during that period of time. Now, I want to zoom out because I want to tell you there's a policy in Australia is mandatory disclosure. Strictly speaking, it's called the Commercial Building Disclosure Program, or CBD. It only operates in offices at the moment, but that's maybe something that we're going to talk about later on today. But what it does is that it scales this NABERS impact from one building into every building in the office sector. Almost every office building has to do this almost every year. So let me show you what that looks like. If you live in one of these 5 cities, for example, you walk in the city center where often the CBD, the Commercial Building District is, you're literally surrounded by buildings that are setting targets measuring the carbon emissions and energy consumption today, like this year. All those data points, you can find them on our website, they're public. And that is actually really unique around the world. This has been around for about 12 years. And it means that we have the highest amount of buildings in the office sector tracking and setting targets and improving in the world. And a lot of people may not know that, but it's a policy that has been around for a little while. And I want to show you the impact of that, because getting an NABERS rating is not the end, it's a means to the end. The end is about reducing energy consumption, reducing emissions. And what this graph is showing is pretty much every office building in the office market, almost all of them, the first time they get a NABERS rating, we take that as a baseline. We say, well, what was your rating? Your rating was 2 stars. Okay, that's your baseline. How much energy are you using a year later? Are you using less energy consumption? Are you improving? And the average is, yeah, the average building uses 3% after a year, and 5% 2 years later, and 12% 3 years later, and so on. And the average is about 33% less energy consumption after 10 years. And what the reason I wanted to show you this graph is because this is the entire office sector. It's not one building, it's like almost the entire office sector. Is the fastest reduction of energy consumption in any sector of the Australian economy, and almost certainly the fastest reduction of energy use among any building sector in any country around the world. And every time we show this graph to someone in Europe or in North America or in Japan, they just get blown away, because most of their markets are actually, if they're reducing it at all, they don't even know. And very likely is that they're staying very steady. They're not reducing consumption in this kind of very, very large scale. By the way, this is the International Energy Agency estimate for how much European countries and OECD countries have improved in the similar period of time. So it's actually significantly faster than that. Now, I'm going to stop sharing there, but I wanted to place that as a frame, because actually most people around the world and in Australia just don't know whether they're using a lot or not. You just don't know that. It's not easy to know that information. And we see a lot of people taking action almost immediately when you know that you're performing terribly. And a lot of your competitors or your neighbors are actually doing better than you. That is a really powerful motivator. And it's maybe something that we can dive a little bit deeper later on in this session.
Thanks, Carlos. Nothing like a good benchmark to work towards. Thank you for sharing all about NABERS. It's such inspirational work underway. I'd now like to introduce you all to another individual with vast experience in sustainable building rating systems, Jorge Chapa. So Jorge, who has met Emma Watkins from the Wiggles, is the head of market transformation at the Green Building Council of Australia, GBCA, and is involved in overseeing Green Star, an independent assessment tool with qualifications in architecture and sustainable design. Jorge has also worked on a number of projects such as a carbon positive roadmap and building with nature. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. Oops. Thank you very much, Lisa. And as anyone who knows me, I seize the opportunity to show slides. So we'll do the same thing, though I have no graphs, which is very sad. I'm going to introduce graphs now. That's my goal. So who and what is the Green Building Council? The Green Building Council of Australia is an industry association. It came out of the Green Olympics, if you recall those back then in the year 2000 in Sydney. That it has the mission to lead the sustainable transformation of the built environment, essentially. We have 4 areas of activities. I won't go into all of them, but I'll talk about probably the 2 that are the things that we're most well known for. But before I do that, I just want to actually place the emissions in context. So a lot of the work that the GBCA does is to take all of the work that multiple entities are doing and putting it all together, right? So we work with Hudson at MECLA on embodied carbon issues. We work and we have an incredibly close collaboration with the NABERS team around reducing energy efficiency and hopefully soon on other projects. But what we then try and do is look at and put everything into one place that says, hey, this is how we need to drive things down. And what if we can use a market-based mechanism to do this? So this is an example of how we look at typical building emissions in context. Now, these are average emissions, right? It doesn't represent any particular buildings. It's just a good example of how to visualize the problem and visualizing the steps that we have to take to get to essentially zero emissions today. There's actually a very simple set of formulas that you can use, right? And this gets you to that point. So a lot of the work that we do is to actually figure out how to drive consensus on these issues. When we have sessions with our members and industry, and we have about 600 member companies, as well as governments, we try and figure out how do we encourage entities to drive to actually go on a path of decarbonization. And some of this work has been going on for a while, and it's been inspired by work that other entities have done, like Beyond Zero Emissions. We've been doing a lot of heavy lifting at trying to surface the importance of embodied carbon emissions, or upfront carbon emissions, as we now call it, in the built environment. We started working about 3 or 4 years ago to start creating business cases to make sure that this was highlighted and recognized worldwide as the next big thing that needed to be dealt with. We've worked with neighbors at trying to demonstrate that, hey, actually, as Carlos has said, measuring energy efficiency makes sense, but also designing so that your measuring energy efficiency makes sense. And we've seen Green Star rated buildings perform very well in neighbors' energy ratings because of this close relationship. We're moving very strongly to getting rid of fossil fuels in buildings, so we're creating practical guides to electrification. But probably the most interesting bit that we've done is setting out very clear roadmaps for targets for industry to follow. And we do this by driving a significant amount of consensus. And the one probably element that we have in Australia that doesn't happen in a lot of other places, or at least that GBCA has, that doesn't happen in a lot of other places, is we have the market-based mechanism to actually drive this through. So it's not just us saying, hey, we should do this thing, but rather saying we should do this thing, and actually this is the standard that you use to recognize that. So we own Green Star, which is a rating system for the built environment. Now, Green Star does cut across new buildings, new homes, existing buildings, precincts, and fit outs, and it's going through a revision right now. And the rating system is comprehensive to energy. But it cares a lot about decarbonizing buildings these days, almost to an obsessive degree, I like to say. We've done a lot of work at embedding very clear targets into the rating tool. In fact, we actually don't have to move a finger. There are targets built into the rating tool that kick in automatically across time over the next decade for new buildings, and for our existing buildings rating tool over the next 2 decades. That is, we actually have to step in and stop these things from happening if we didn't get them wrong, or we can accelerate them, but they automatically increase. So for example, the highest rating that we have, which is 6 stars, you actually have to deliver a climate positive building, which is essentially a highly energy efficient building, fully powered by renewables, fossil fuel free, built with low upfront carbon emissions. That kicks in next year for the next tier of ratings, and then the next year to the next tier of ratings, and all with the goal of actually driving change at the policy setting. And this is what happens with the existing building sector. We're trying to increase the path of decarbonization by saying it's not at 2050, all existing buildings need to be decarbonized. Actually, it's by 2040. And that means a very specific set of circumstances that we need to start acting now. You mentioned, Heidi, we actually have to refurbish a lot of things. And the number that we keep quoting to people is, if we started refurbishing and we wanted to get to net zero by 2050, we have to refurbish 1,000 houses and units and buildings every day, right? Starting 2 years ago, and that's working 24/7 for the rest of our working lives, everyone in this call, essentially, which is a big number. So that's the context that we're in and how quickly we need to move on. I'll leave that there for everyone, and I look forward to the conversations and questions. I am very impressed by everyone's presentations and introductions, so I hope I can be of some contribution.
Thanks so much, Jorge, and thanks everyone. That was really insightful. And we've got a few questions already in the chat that the first couple really do align nicely with your last comment there, Jorge, that, was it 1,000 units and houses retrofitted every day? So we've got a question from Julie, and then a one to follow up from Beth, perhaps, for each of you. Maybe we'll start with Hudson, then to Heidi, Carlos, and Jorge for your responses. So first question from Julie: what are the current barriers to scaling and speeding up retrofitting of existing homes, and what can be done to overcome them? And a follow-up question from Beth: how are you hoping to work with the new government on sustainable and equitable housing? Hudson.
Great. Well, it's a complex answer, and there are many components to it. I think lots of people learning about climate change hear about the frog in the cool water that's on the stove and turns up. It doesn't jump out. You drop a frog into boiling water, it jumps straight out. This has been a gradual build-up for people in existing dwellings, and unless there's a sharp heat, like the big shock, the energy price shocks that we're getting now, it's hard to have a trigger. renovation is a good time, or moving into a new house. But if it's just been the same old, there often isn't a trigger for people to want to do this. The second thing I'd say is where to start. At the soccer field, watching my son play soccer, several of the parents know what I do for a living, and they say, oh, we're thinking about solar, but I don't know where to start. And there's so many cowboys out there. And then they want to talk about water heaters and insulation, and it's just all too much. That kind of fuzz of information is also a factor.
And so I'll build on that with a very specific solution I think we should all go away and take a look at. So our role, res ambition. This is not easy to implement, but could be. So we're looking at things called managed energy services agreements because of the complexity and the level of choice and information that you need to be able to sort of take in and then make a lot of complex decisions about how to do energy upgrades for homes, especially. Consumers don't care that much. So it's like everyone who's really passionate about this, who has access to the information, who has financial resources to be able to do it, kind of on the journey already. It's everyone else that we're missing. And those are the people who maybe don't have the financial resources, who don't own the home that they live in. We are looking at managed energy services agreements, which is essentially turning that choice about your energy provider, who am I going to go with, who am I going to buy my energy from, and turning that one decision into one where that company that you go with can actually do the retrofits, do the energy assessments, amalgamate the cost of doing the upfront cost of the retrofit with the ongoing savings on your energy bill, and turn that into one decision. So that is the level of simplicity that we need to be aiming for when it comes to this. That's complex to implement. I can see a lot of the panelists nodding vigorously. Yeah, that's complicated. There's a couple of things that this solution can do for us, which is to, with the right adjustments in the rental market, this could actually benefit renters by being able to provide a fixed price for their energy that can be passed on by their landlord. And there's a couple of reasons why that can become a simple solution, but my minute is up, so I get to pass on to someone else.
I might just jump right in terms of the, so Neighbours doesn't, we don't work in individual dwellings and houses, but we work with every state territory in the Australian government working in that space. So we know a lot of those things really, really well. And I'll say, one of the biggest barriers, just to answer the question directly, is the fact that most people just don't know how inefficient the houses are. And maybe more importantly, the clearest trigger point for somebody to make a decision is when you're purchasing a house. And most countries that have been really successful in driving, at scale changes to their housing stock have been going, well, if somebody's going to spend $1 million on a house, what if that house, two identical houses, what if one of them was much better insulated, much more comfortable and more energy efficient? You're going to spend less, but more importantly, it's going to be comfortable. And the other house is going to be uncomfortable. And a lot of countries have just gone through, let's just make sure that everyone have that information when they make that decision. A lot of countries have had success just with doing that, or building on top of that. In Australia, just doesn't have that. So today, there are lots of people going out there spending the most expensive, the biggest purchase of their lives, and they cannot factor in the sustainability of that house in the price or the decision making. And I think that there's a lot of work underway. Governments are working together, trying to create a national framework so we can bring that into the market. But I think as long as we don't have that, these decisions on what the market is going to encourage in terms of sustainability, we just cannot activate the market if we don't have that. And I think it's a clear opportunity going forward.
Carlos, I need to jump in there because the ACT government has the ACTAs. ACT House.
The ACT is the exception.
Scheme.
Yes.
And
my apologies.
No, I'm not wanting to nitpick. All I'm saying is that the COAG, Council of Australian Government, actually did agree that there should be a framework and that at point of sale and point of lease, all houses should have an energy rating. But the ACT was the only jurisdiction to implement it. And with my consultant hat on, not my MECLA hat on, I'm doing some work in the volume builder space. And when I talk to volume builders building homes for first home buyers and so on, those that have exposure to the ACT market, so that it's easier to sell a high energy rating building there. One, because it's bloody cold, but mainly because the residents know that an existing older, maybe charming dwelling in an established suburb has an energy rating of maybe 2 or 3 stars, but in a new development like Gin and Dairy, which is really trying to push the sustainability bar up high, it gets 7 or 8 stars, and they have a frame of reference. Just like buying a car that's got a 2-star safety rating or a 5-star safety rating, the buyer doesn't have to be an expert on brakes and suspension and airbags. They just know it's got 5 stars. The ACT consumer has that frame of reference. Even if they're a student renting a student house, it comes with an energy rating as well as a weekly rent. So ACT's done it.
Hudson, I couldn't agree more with you. And I think I'm going to throw a pass to her here as well, because the GBC has done so much work on housing in the last couple of years. But I completely agree. And I think that's one of the longer term benefits of things like disclosure. We've seen this in offices and definitely in the ACT in housing, is that it's not just about the next decision when you're going to purchase a house, is that the fact that you get exposed to different houses and efficient and more efficient and inefficient, it means that it's a topic of conversation. You go to someone's house and you're like, oh, this house is really comfortable. Oh, actually it's a 7-star Natas. And then suddenly, you know, you have a frame of reference to be able to discuss and make sustainability, which is very fuzzy, into very concrete. Oh, this is what it means to have a sustainable house. If you live in Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, you can't do that, and unless it's a new house. If it's an existing house, you have absolutely no idea how thermally comfortable that house is. And I think disclosure would go a very long way towards making this a really concrete point of conversation going forward. Jorge, do you mind if I just pass that along to you?
Not at all. I think, first of all, I agree, like disclosure is definitely has to be the first step around this. I mean, the fact of the matter is you buy a house, you're going to live in it for a few years. And the only way of finding out if it's uncomfortable in it is if it's going to be, you're going to have to put in the HVAC system and you're still going to be uncomfortable in it, is by walking there. Really hot week, right? At the end of a hot week, because a hot day doesn't give you that. A hot week will give you that. So that's I received a call at the same time. So that's a problem. So definitely having transparency and disclosure matters. The other thing is, no matter how we think about the problem, it's a hard problem. It's a very long tail, and it is a very long, very costly tail. So at some point, we are going to have to start making choices and very difficult decisions about what policy settings exist to enable that to happen. Right now, we're talking about that we need about a refurbishment rate for housing of about 3 inching to 4%. Australia currently does at best 1%. That is a big gap that we have to cross. And the only way of doing that is by having the right policy levers and the policy settings to encourage that level of refurbishment. That includes finance, and that also includes a significantly more trained and diverse supply chain for materials, which does not exist. We keep talking about this thing like we're trying to sometimes, or we sometimes have these conversations like we're just shifting a couple thousand houses here or there. We're talking millions over a long and sustained period of time. And the implications of doing that has actual effects on energy networks and infrastructure that is well outside what the houses deliver. So we're gonna have to have genuinely serious conversations about what it means to do this over the next 30 years, because it will require decisions, and it will require very quick, very significant decisions over the next 3 or 4 years.
Jorge, there's a question from Panellists in the chat that follows up nicely from that. So maybe we'll go back through from Jorge, Carlos. Hudson,
sure, I'll start.
Heidi, Hudson.
I think the things that have been mentioned really do matter. Transparency is going to be a great way to get this stuff started. That is genuinely important, and we do want to see that happen. There's other things that we need to start seeing. So the disclosure is going to matter, but also we're going to have to think about how we incentivize the right level of refurbishments around energy efficiency and so on. There are programs, for example, elsewhere in the world that if you're going to refurbish the house, you need to move up an energy rating label, right? They have that, and you're going to have to move up. And it's no longer optional. Those are the types of things that we're going to have to start being creative. We need to start genuinely thinking about our energy sources in our buildings and making a choice as to what energy source we go for will matter and it has genuine implications. I saw another question there about social housing, right? Like that's a genuine, the changes to the dynamics of the grid has a genuine implication for a just and equitable transition. And it's significant. I do think, and thankfully we do have a low carbon energy trajectory for a national construction code that's been already announced. We hope that we can stick to that or make it even more ambitious. That at least gives us a guiding principle for what new housing will look like in the future, or new apartments will look like in the future. Though we need to get just better at communicating what those changes are far in advance so that the supply chain can adapt, and we don't need to have this fight every 3 years whenever we decide to do the code updates.
Lisa, there's a couple of questions that what they have in common is about how can we advocate government for change or more action or specific policies. And I wanted to dive a little bit into that because part of my work, and you may not know this, but when somebody asks for a meeting to any minister really anywhere, then there's a brief that goes internally into the relevant department and they have to prepare the meeting. There's often a senior public servant who's at those meetings. And so I get to go to a lot of those. And I think there's a couple of, mistakes that often are made in advocacy. And it's really important to understand how the system works. So meeting with ministers with very, very clear ask is important. And I think people should do it. And it's often really important to do it through networks and big industry bodies rather than individual organizations, because big industry bodies can speak for large parts of the market. So they are going to get more attention, rightly so, I think, because they often represent a consensus position across lots of different organizations instead of the views of one individual. But the part that a lot of people don't do very well, so a lot of people do that side, is actually engaging with the department. And I think that is something that advocacy organizations, so people advocating for change, should do a lot more. Policymakers in most governments, they are not front-facing roles with industry. A lot of them just don't have any meetings with industry stakeholders. So your ideas that you pitch into a minister who has a million things, 90% of those will be lost in that meeting. And then the specifics of what you're asking for are never going to reach the people who are creating those policies because you're not talking to them. And I do think organizing meetings with the departments those people also tend to have time to understand the detailed issues about the more granular aspects of those proposals. And I think that is really important. I think we should do that a lot more. And if you would have seen, for example, Romilly Maddow, who used to be the CEO of the Green Building Council, she's the CEO of the Infrastructure Australia at Transform earlier this year.
Engineers Australia.
Yeah, Engineers Australia, my apologies.
Yeah, she's moving now, yes.
Yes, and she basically said, please don't just advocate to politicians. You must engage with the public servants, because if your ideas don't make it there, the policies are going to be built at that level. And so that's basically a call to action on there's lots of public servants that are in a position to meet with big industry bodies and want to do that, but big industry bodies often just don't necessarily reach out to them with these ideas.
That is so incredibly important. And Carlos, I think it's not spoken about often enough, like the pathway to actually turning a great idea into action. So when we think of this at Beyond Zero Emissions, we're really thinking for what is this a solution? So if you say, oh my gosh, so one of the challenges we need to overcome is this scale and speed challenge about decarbonizing our existing building stock. That is a scale and speed challenge, which needs many different solutions. You say, well, what else could that actually do? Well, there are these other problems, right, that we're facing. We're facing economic challenges from the loss of our fossil fuel revenue, the imminent loss of fossil fuel revenue from decarbonisation, from carbon border adjustment mechanisms, impacting our ability to have, financial viability in a global market, because so much of what Australia takes to the global market is fossil fuels. People don't want that anymore. That's a problem because people are going to lose jobs over that. We have entire infrastructure systems built around that. We also have problems around training and, how can we actually set up jobs and long-term opportunities for people so that we can get excited about having something viable and long-term for our future across Australia. We're not just talking about cities and university educated folks who go and sit at a computer all day for a job, which is, myself, but like actual jobs. Like we need the stuff to be able to, we need physical materials and equipment to put into these buildings. Where is that going to come from? So when you lay out and you can kind of layer up enough problems, they actually have solutions that feed into each other. So for what is this a solution? Well, fantastic. Let's look at what our workforce can offer us that's now perhaps vulnerable to imminent price shocks. Let's have a look at how they could actually start to be the talent that we utilize to create onshore domestic production of some of these materials and products that we're going to need to then be able to decarbonize. And I think that can be a very effective way to build a compelling case around policy change, because we want this one thing to come out of the end of it. But there are so many other challenges. So being able to recruit that alliance of beneficiaries around that solution, I think is really fundamental, and I think actually speaks to, Hudson, the really neat way that you described MECLA before. That is the way that Beyond Zero Emissions works with our industry partners to be able to draw together that coalition of beneficiaries for a solution that may not be the obvious one. The challenge that we're addressing may not be the obvious one that actually they're all aligned behind, but it's the big whiteboard with all of those loops that you described, connecting everyone together to say, here are the winners, and we can actually create a solution here that would stitch those together and create an absolute win for so many other people. We're all calling for the same thing then, that challenge of retrofitting thousands of homes around the country, or thousands of buildings around the country every day, becomes the opportunity that we need for a strong economy, a strong workforce, and a really relevant export market.
So I'd build on that by making a couple of observations. One, we're dealing here with two very distinct markets. The sophisticated commercial office, which is the Australia Square audience, that will use a business case to make its decisions. They'll understand return on investment, they'll understand branding, they'll understand the desire for tenants, high paying tenants, to be in a premium office space that has high productivity and very sophisticated level of decision making, which informs the market that provides that office space, that service, to produce, to prepare, to offer a premium product. And if not, they have to offer a brown discount. There used to be a green premium. I would argue that there's now a brown discount if you're not in that space. The home sector is a totally different market. And again, with a consultant hat on, not a MECLA hat on, I'm doing a lot of work in that volume builder sector, and I've spoken to 14 different builders in the last couple of months, and the reality is they don't see this as their job. They're just building houses, and the supply chain has been set up to assemble the biggest house on the smallest lot for the lowest price and compete on price. And then a bunch of sustainability people like us are saying, well, we've got to change the rules and we've got to make it more expensive, and it's going to be cheaper to live in, and in 10 years, you're going to love it. And their customer base is saying, we just want to get the deposit together. And unlike the sophisticated business case decision-making for a commercial transaction, the home buyer is essentially an emotional transaction, emotional decision-making. And so unless we start to factor in consumer behavior and building consumer desire, I think all the regulation is only going to go so far, and it will meet significant resistance from builders who simply don't see it as their job. So switching the conversation to include all of the awareness building and the policy and the supplies, we need the Kardashians to make this stuff cool. We need Tesla equivalent to make this stuff appealing. You know, if we'd all gone to the government and said, we want Ford and Holden, you've got to lobby them to build an electric car, we'd still be driving Falcons and Commodores. It took Elon Musk with a huge ego and a huge budget to build a really sexy, faster, cooler car. And even non-greenies love it because it is just awesome. And I think we need to factor that consumer desire into this so that people just want it. And the word comfort instead of sustainability, I think is, and Carlos, you've used that a couple of times, and I know, Jorge, that's in your lexicon as well. Making the desire so that the frog wants to get out of the water before it boils is just going to be so important. And, you know, I joke about the Kardashians, but we know the power of TV shows like The Block, and we know that Renovate or Rebuild has been funded and was on 9 Now, an offshoot of Channel 9, to make this stuff appealing and had significant behavioural science behind it. I think that is a huge lever in the home sector to make this stuff happen.
We had that conversation ourselves when we launched. So we now have a Green Star Home standard. It's literally 6 months old, right? It's barely just started. But the conversation we had very early on, about 2 years, 3 years ago, when we're starting to think about the standard and what it should be, is we had to fight against what we kind of said, like our worst instinct, right? Like we had to leave the green person in us outside the door and have a conversation about what this thing was. And so if you look at Green Star for big buildings, right? And, Barangaroo, there's like 70 odd indicators in the rating tool. That's a lot. Also, Barangaroo is worth a few $100 million. So it's fine, right? Or a few $1 billion. In a house, what do you do? So we essentially took everything that we knew about how to do rating tools for buildings and just came up and said, what this is going to say is one thing and one thing only. Is this a good house? Yes or no? That's it. And it's going to be about, making it sexy. It's got to have comfort. It's led by the comfort conversation. It is led by the sexiness of the technology conversation in the fully powered by renewables piece. It is in the sexy piece about having induction cooktops instead of like old ugly gas stuff. Essentially, we then said, great, and now all of this doesn't make sense if we don't have a great marketing campaign to go with. We developed a great marketing campaign, right? Like it's been vetted by their marketing teams for volume home builders. We've been talking to, we had banks, right? We had Commonwealth Bank put out their green loan. And so it was just talking essentially and saying, we're going to try and get out of the way for trying to solve every problem to just solve a very specific, unique problem, which is houses are built to the code at best. How do we move them just one step forward? And how do we make it so that it's sexy and desirable? There's still a ton of challenges, right? The supply chain in Australia for materials and products is woefully inadequate. Only country in the world probably that pays more for double glazed windows and single glazed windows in a house, to be honest. Like, I tell the story when we first started the process, we called up our colleagues all over the world and we're kind of talking about them, like what their experiences were and so on. And we're talking to the German Green Building Council, and they said, well, what sort of things are you doing in your standard, right? Like, what are you trying to do? And we told them all of this, and then we go, oh yeah, and the house needs to be double glazed. And they were like, what do you mean the house has to be double glazed? And what do you guys do? And we're like, oh, it's single glazing in Australia. And one person there literally just bursted out laughing and said, if I wanted to get single windows for my house, I had to custom order them, right? That's how silly this is here. So those are the things that we all need to work on to just improve the residential sector.
Yeah, and if the customer asks for it, that's the dominant thrust from the builders say when I'm asking them, could you do this? Would you do this? And their response is, if the customer asks for it, otherwise we can't take the risk. We can't afford the risk. And if government tells them, they'll push back hard through their representatives, not individually, but through their lobby groups.
And I think that this is probably a good time. I really want to bookmark again. When we are talking about consumers who have choices, then yes, everything that we've just been talking about makes a lot of sense. But really, we have millions of Australian homes, millions of Australian families who are not making choices based on lifestyle or premium products. And when we think about rapidly decarbonising and sharing the benefits of that, we really need to be focused on those markets where this needs to be a normal option, as normal as choosing your electricity provider, and having all of these decisions and all of those value questions, all of the coordination and the knowledge that we're talking about building up in these sophisticated customers who want to make choices, that actually needs to be removed. And it really just needs to be as simple as, I'm going to choose this energy provider, and behind the scenes, everything else is done for me, because this is going to bring like a more stable and reliable energy supply. It's going to bring more health and comfort to our communities. And it's actually going to be the thing that decarbonizes and makes our building stock better and more resilient for the future. And they're the kind of benefits that I think can steer a public policy decision and really take a lot of the complexity and the resistance in the market to taking this up out of the equation. I just want to put a little bookend in there again, like yes, and to the sophisticated consumers, and removing all of that complexity where it's necessary as well.
I think it's a really good point, Heidi. And I think there was a question before about talking about this incoming government and the intersection of social policies and sustainability. And I think that anyone who's interested in that space strongly encourages you to read Labor's political platform before the election. I forgot the name right now. I think it's Power in Australia. And because every mention of energy efficiency in that context is done in a social sense, as a social policy. And so I do anticipate that is an intersection where the incoming government will be looking for interesting ideas on how to progress both. I did want to do a little bit of a small pivot, because we've spoken a lot about residential, but it's good to remember that the other half of the built environment in terms of emissions and electricity and waste and almost everything else is non-residential. And I showed a graph before about how the office sector in Australia has been just making this incredible progress. And to be honest, it is world leading, and there's lots of stats that Jorge and I can show you, showing that Australia is really leading, like the #1 country in that space. But that is not the entire non-residential sector. If you look at the hotel sector, nothing like that is happening. If you look at most of retail, with the exception of some portfolios, nothing on that magnitude is happening. Hospitals, schools are not improving at that scale. And I wanted to mention that because if you think about the economy, almost the majority of sectors of the economy operate inside of buildings. A huge portion of the carbon footprint is inside of these assets, and they're not in a trajectory to zero emissions at all. They're very far from that. And all these energy savings, all the things that we saw in offices are possible in all those sectors of the same magnitude at the same speed. The technology is the same. They use energy and emissions in exactly the same ways. What we don't have is their interest, like the interest on feeling like we must decarbonize because otherwise we're not competitive. So, and Hudson, you mentioned before about like the rational thinking and putting business cases, and that's true when a portfolio has decided to take action. But energy efficiency historically for 50 years, people just don't do it. Even if it makes sense financially, people just don't take action. And I think we need to bring what you meant before about for residential, we need to make people care emotionally. We actually have to do that at the business level as well. And for a lot of businesses, they need to feel that decarbonizing is a huge opportunity if you decarbonize now, because it gives you a leading edge against competitors if you're in a competitive market. But also it's a huge risk, because if you don't, you can lose clients, you can lose market share, your money to work at a discount. And we haven't been able to do that in a lot of sectors, and we must do that as fast as we can, because we don't have a lot of time to drive and it's an enormous amount of change we need to drive across millions of different organizations. And to do that, we just really need to create those drivers that hit markets all at once.
Thank you so much, all of you. We've got 2 minutes left of this webinar, so I'd like to just share the thanks of everyone on the call for all that you're doing. So many great insights there, and I have so many questions, and there were a few in the chat that we didn't get to, including one from Panellists on the most exciting project you've been working on that's had an emissions impact. So maybe with a goodbye, you could all just share one exciting project that's had an emissions impact in recent times. And I'll just point to, we've had a couple of webinars previously that have unpacked some of the things discussed today at a deeper level with Amanda Sturgeon and other speakers across different areas of the sector. And we're planning another webinar date to be advised with Kelly Court and Joel and Rob from Renew and others on the more of the social housing side of things, for how we can bring all Australians along in this efficiency and better homes, zero emissions homes and buildings journey. So thank you all, and please do just share an exciting thing that has happened or something that you're looking forward to send us all off on a high note.
I'm happy to start. I was at the ACT conference, last Friday. It was a session that the Property Council organized. And one of the things that was very striking was the speed and direction that the ACT government is putting forth in terms of moving away from natural gas. That's an incredible policy, great direction, and it sets out very clear targets for people to go for. And that's an area that I'm very, very excited to see. Hopefully, at some point, move into other areas as well.
I'll put in a quick plug for Beyond Zero Emissions, the work we're doing in partnership with local communities in the Hunter and in Gladstone. Look up our work on renewable energy industrial precincts. decarbonising existing manufacturers, building out the sector so that we can provide locally the products and equipment we need for the next economy that we're building.
I was yesterday in Canberra meeting with our colleagues in the Commonwealth government, and obviously I can't tell you the things that we discussed, but I can tell you this: the mood in Canberra, we met with lots of people, is very different to what it's been in the past, because there's a feeling of genuine opportunity, not just because the change in government, but also because of the surveys around the election on climate change being the #1 issue for voters at this election. That's never happened before. And so I just sense a lot of optimism within government and obviously industry as well. We have a platform to be able to do great things in the next couple of years, and we should be really focused. So we use this as an opportunity to progress a lot of the difficult things that we need to progress going forward.
And with my MECLA hat on, I just say that the forming of MECLA has been very exciting. It's early days in terms of what can it achieve as an alliance, but the conversations, as I say, pre-competition, the traditional rivals coming together to say we need to move forward together is hugely gratifying, because it's a concept we had a hunch might work, and it looks to be getting buy-in. I would say to anybody on the call, if you're interested, MECLA 2.0, where in July we start the next phase of MECLA, please reach out and join if you're interested. And if you don't want to join but you want to learn, we're producing resources, case studies, dictionaries, frameworks to spread the word. So a lot of momentum coming. All of these people on the panel are part of that conversation. And if you've got questions or want to reach out, please get in touch. MECLA's all ears. It's about the collaboration.
Thank you, Hudson, Heidi, Carlos, Jorge, for offering glimpses into a better climate resilient built environment sector for us all. Thank you for all you're doing and for your time today. And we'll wrap it there. And I'll definitely be sharing Annalisa's report with everyone. So thanks for all, and enjoy the rest of your week. See ya.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.